But now that Garrett is raised, suddenly it's Andy who's in a really weird spot. This hand has gone in such a strange direction. And Garrett very well could have played pocket aces or something this way.
Hey everybody, I'm Bart Hanson from Crush Live Poker. We're going to take a look here at one of the more memorable hands from Hustler Casino Live that just happened this past Friday, involving Garrett, Andy, and a third player, and Garrett and Andy were nearly $360,000 deep.
1,000.
Now a real hand for Andy.
Yeah.
It's got to feel great, right? You play like kind of a maniac.
We good? No. Oh no, I'm making sure.
For 45 minutes or so, and then you pick up pocket queens. Garrett, though, has ace-king suited. We could see some serious fireworks between these two players.
Here it is. 14,000.
Garrett surely aware of how out of line, maybe out of line is the wrong word, but how loose Andy has been over these past 45 minutes or so, and will be in no mood to back down, especially with a hand this good. Just a call from Andy. Does Han want to come along? He's not very deep. He does make the call. Three ways. Almost $43,000 already in this pot.
So playing 100, 200, 400 with a 200 big blind ante, Andy starts it off with a raise here with pocket queens to 1,000, and we get a 3-bet here from Han in the cutoff with 5-6 suited. Sometimes you can obviously mix this in. I was a little bit surprised to see this, actually, the way that Han was playing, but definitely not something that's too far out there. Gained yourself the button. Now it gets over here to Garrett, however, who is in the small blind, and he picks up a huge hand in ace-king suited, and you can see how deep these guys are. I mean, 360,000 effective, and he's going to 4-bet here, and I love the play. Ace-king suited, definitely a hand that is mostly put in for the extra bet. He wants to drive out the people that are in the blinds. Also, Andy raised from mid-ish position here, and then you've got a late position 3-bet, so this could work right away, but usually what this is going to do is going to add fold equity, and you can win the pot a lot pre-flop, or just sort of clean it up and basically get it heads up so that you can take the pot down later post-flop. Now for Andy, he's got a really sort of interesting decision here too, because he's super deep with Garrett. He doesn't really probably feel comfortable putting in the 5-bet with queens this deep, but he's got a guy behind him, and if he does call, Han is going to get really, really priced in here, but he's sort of in a kind of a catch-22. He's got a hand that's probably not quite good enough to put the 5-bet in, but definitely way, way too good to fold. But if he does call, chances are he's going to play from the middle multi-way, which can be very treacherous. If Andy were to have a hand like 7-6 suited, something like this, I think this would just definitely be a pitch, because chances are he would be in the middle and not have ultimate position. So he does end up making the call. And over to Han here with 5-6 suited, getting a pretty decent price here. And the thing about 5-6 suited that I'll say is that in a spot like this, usually your cards are going to be pretty live. You're not going to interact with some of the high cards that are out there on the board. And you can do a lot of semi-bluffing on ragged types of boards and represent hands that probably Garrett, who's the pre-flop 4-better, just isn't going to have 4-betting in this particular spot. So he ends up making the call, and we end up going here to the flop in a 4-bet pot 3 ways.
Interesting flop. Nut flush draw for Garrett. Bottom pair and a gutter for Han, and an overpair for Andy. Garrett checks, knows that this is not his board exactly.
So the flop comes out 9-8-5 here with 2 diamonds, which is super interesting because we've got Garrett flopping the nut flush draw and 2 overcards, Andy continuing to have an overpair, and Hans got a little something here too with a gut shot, backdoor spade draw, and also a pair here. But the interesting thing about this particular board is that this is definitely much, much better for the guys that defend to the 4-bet than for Garrett, because when you think about Garrett's 4-betting range, he's not going to have really a hand like 6-7 suited all that much, if ever. Usually he's going to have hands like ace king, ace queen, big pairs, and those types of hands, especially with the stack depth against Andy, are not going to be hands you want to put a lot of money in on this type of board. He also has sort of the best non-pair hand with the nut flush draw. So even if he were to bet, if he couldn't get any real pairs to fold, I mean, he is making a pot bigger towards the nuts, but there isn't a huge point of betting. So I think he would actually be doing a fair amount of checking here, sometimes with big overpairs. Garrett does play an exploitable style where he will sometimes bet these boards in these spots, but multi-way with the nut flush draw, keeping his hand a little bit hidden as well, meaning that maybe someone else is going to represent the flush draw that he might make on a later street, he ends up checking. This is where it gets interesting, though, for Andy, because Andy quickly checks as well. And I think this is a kind of a combination of a little bit of pot control, knowing that Garrett still might have aces and kings, and also knowing that he's got 2 queens. Han 3-bet and then called. Han could have a hand that might actually interact with this board because he was getting such a good price closing the action on the flop. And it gets over to Han, and he's got a decision here as well, because both of these guys have checked to him. He has a pair of 5s and a gut shot. Does he want to make a protection bet against overcards that these players might have? Does he think that these guys have like over pairs? Does he want to start possibly even turning his hand into a bluff if he bets here or credibly represent diamonds if they were to say come off, which of course Garrett has in his hand, which is why he played it this way. So I could actually see some betting here. I could definitely see some betting heads up, but because it's multi-way, possibly maybe taking a card and seeing what happens. That's exactly what he does. He checks, so it gets checked around.
It checks around. Garrett checks it again. See if Andy goes for some value now.
25,000.
About 60% pot. And I think if Han had a realistic path to winning this hand, it was probably with a bet on the flop. Starting with a bet on the flop anyway.
10 seconds.
Oh yeah.
All in.
He disagrees, moves all in for $66,000.
45. 50.
And Garrett's kind of in an annoying spot now. With a flush draw, but still with just ace high on a paired board. And a 4-bet pot.
8, 64, 65, 65.
And Andy behind him still.
50, 56, 60, 64, 65, 5.
Tricky spot for Garrett. I don't really see what he can do here.
56, 60, 65, 5.
Garrett may realize that Han's line doesn't make a whole lot of sense, and that Andy can potentially have a lot of stuff here.
One more.
But he does still have to deal with both of them, and he still just has ace high. $133,000 already in this pot. Garrett going through the mental hard drive, trying to find a creative way to win this hand. But with Han already all in, this is a very tough spot. Garrett's going to go for it with a raise.
101.
He makes it 101,000, and he is going to try to find a creative way to win this hand. I did not see that coming. And now what do you do with pocket queens? If Garrett had folded, I was going to say that Andy's decision is quite easy. He can just call against Han. But now that Garrett is raised, suddenly it's Andy who's in a really weird spot. This hand has gone in such a strange direction. And Garrett very well could have played pocket aces or something this way, checking the flop and the turn after 4-betting and getting this board. Suddenly, pocket queens are in an awful spot.
So we roll the turn here, and it's the 9 of clubs pairing the top card. And I think that this would be a little bit strange if Garrett had like aces or kings, possibly to come out and start betting now. It's possible you could put out a little bit of a protection bet here, but it is a little bit of a strange spot. I mean, you'd have to think about how often your opponents would bet off a 9. I could see maybe like 15, 20,000 if you had an overpair. But again, this sort of goes back to the flop concept. I'm not really sure if he's going to get any pair right here to fold, and he has the best non-paired hand with ace king, so he decides to check it over here to Andy. Now, Andy, after Garrett has checked twice with this type of board out there with straight draws and flush draws, he probably does want to put in some sort of protection bet. He knows that Garrett is probably capable of possibly still having aces or kings, but he does bet here on the turn, and he goes for 25,000. Now, this is the real interesting spot here, because I think you need to take a look here at Han's stack size. So the pot right now is 67,800. If Han were to call, it would be around 92.8, and he'd only have about 40,000 left. So just under a half pot size bet. And obviously there's a lot of sort of board changing cards, but I got to tell you, if I was in this spot, I would probably lean towards folding, even though he's getting almost 3-1 in turn pot odds, knowing that Garrett still might have a hand behind here. But if Andy had a pair above a 5, I mean, Han is really only drawing to a 7 for a straight or a 5. And then, of course, if Andy had a 9, he'd really only have a gut shot in this particular spot. So I would really lean towards a fold as opposed to a call. But Han actually ends up taking a different line here, and I'm going to try to explain what probably his thinking was. He ends up moving all in. Now, I think that the only time that this might possibly be the right play, goes all in for 65,900, is if somehow he thought that with his all in, he could get Garrett off of a better hand than a pair of 5s. And also, Andy either had nothing or he could get a fold as well. The problem is, coming back over the top, Andy's going to be getting incredible pot odds. I mean, it's only going to be 40,000 for a $133,000 pot. I don't think that Andy is really going to be folding any pair here. But sometimes when the pot gets big, sometimes guys just decide to just kind of go with it. But that would be really the only situation where I think that this play would be prudent, if somehow we could get Garrett off a better hand and we thought that Andy had air, because I don't think that Andy's ever folding pretty much any hand that he's really betting for. Now, back here for the real decision, and that's going to be a decision here for Garrett. He has checked ace-king as the nut flush draw here twice. The pot is 133,000, and it's 700 for him to call, which means he's getting almost 2-1. Nobody bet the flop, so it's possible someone could have a 9, but probably little bit more unlikely. It's also possible someone could have just done, slow play and had 6-7, where your ace and your king might not be good, and then maybe someone had a boat too. Those things are all possible, but it's, I think, even more likely that all his outs are good as played with this extreme nature pre-flop in a 4-bet pot, where usually you're not going to see these types of hands represented on this type of board, even though Han does have 5-6 suited. But he also has to deal with Andy behind him here as well. And you can see that these guys are relatively deep. Now, Han's already all in. So Garrett has to beat Han in this spot if he's going to call. So I was thinking that Garrett was either going to call here, which was more likely, and possibly sometimes make a really, really tough fold. So Garrett actually ends up doing something that I was not expecting. He is actually going to min-click this raise back. He's going to raise it up to 106 16,000, just over the minimum. We call this one a min click. He min click 3 bets the all-in raise here from Han. And like I said, I was not expecting that. And the reason why I wasn't expecting that is because if Andy actually has something super strong, like a boat or a straight or even a 9, he is not going to fold. So sometimes when you have to beat somebody who might have a pair or something better than your hand, and there's someone else in the pot and you have the nut draw, you actually want that extra money in the pot because you still have to beat this guy that is all in. The only time that this play would make some sense is if somehow Garrett thought that Han had a lower draw than him, a hand like Jack 10 that was checked through, or some sort of lower diamond, some sort of non-paired hand here that he beats, and he can also get Andy off of a better hand. So if someone had a lower draw and someone had a better made hand, in this case be Andy, if you were to raise, sometimes Ace King can win unimproved. But that is, I think, a very unlikely scenario, and it's really, really dipping pretty deep. I think if I were Garrett here, I probably would have just called, but he ends up doing the min click here up to 106,000. And again, he does put his stack at a little bit of jeopardy, but this is why he put up the min raise. He didn't want to obviously commit everything. And if for some reason Andy came back over the top for a back raise, I think it would be a relatively easy fold, but he doesn't want to commit any more. He's committing the minimum to get Andy off of a hand like he has, with the hope that Han might have a worse non-paired kind of draw hand. And now we got decision point number 2. Back over here to Andy. He bet the turn. This guy moved all in short, and now Garrett, who is the 4-better pre-flop, comes back over the top for a min click. A min click here on the turn. So the pot is 234,000, and it's 101,000 for Andy to call. If you were to call, it would be over 335,000, and these guys would have about just under a pot size bet left effective, I would say. This is just a brutal spot for Andy here, because here's the problem. He's got to beat both players. I think that this is an unorthodox line by Garrett. Maybe once in a while he takes it with aces and kings. Maybe once in a while he actually had something very, very thick with like 8s full, or he shows up maybe once in a while with a 9, but he shows up with something. I think him having ace king suited here with diamonds is probably a very small portion of his range. So he's got to be thinking that most likely Garrett has a hand that beats him, and then also he has to beat this guy behind him here as well. And this is really sort of demonstrating how treacherous it is to play some of these hands super multi-way. And Andy was stuck because he ran that big bluff earlier. And you talk about mental game, to be in these particular spots and getting these kind of brutal situations, it can be very treacherous and really be mentally challenging. But I just think that this is an impossible spot for Andy to continue here multi-way. I mean, you could make a case for a call and see what develops, but there aren't going to be really any good cards for him at the end, except for, you know, obviously a queen to make queens full. He could call and then possibly on a brick, if Garrett were to shove, fold, knowing that Garrett would be betting into a dry sidebot.
And Andy folds.
Just a really tough, difficult spot for Andy, and you can't fault him for laying it down, and he ends up laying down the best hand.
And now we're in a very strange situation where Han could win this hand with a pair of 5s.
So now that he ends up laying down queen, Han is ahead here with just a 5. Han's ahead here with just a 5. Garrett actually has 35% equity. Now, the graphics take into account some of the dead cards, some of the cards that people have folded pre-flop. If we didn't know the cards, we could actually count the outs here for Garrett. Obviously, he's got 3 aces, 3 kings, 9 diamonds. That's 15 outs. But he also has counterfeit outs, too. He has another 2 8s, which not calling diamonds, so like 17 outs. And a kind of quick way to do that is multiply your outs by 2. Yeah, he has over 1/3 equity with 1 card to come, which is a lot of equity on a draw in Hold'em with one card to come. But right now, a pair of fives is leading for almost a $200,000 pot.
You have a pair?
One time confirm.
No pair? Go ahead.
One time.
Go ahead, one time. Oh, sorry. Do you have a pair or no? I don't have a pair.
Could Han win a massive pot with just a pair of fives here?
We can shoot.
Yes.
If you want.
You don't need to. If you have a pair, you're ahead.
What a weird hand. And it does brick out, and Han is going to win this pot.
Good hand.
What a weird pot indeed. The river bricks out, and Han wins almost a $200,000 pot with just a pair of fives. Do me a favor, if you like what you've seen, hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and check out another video that I made several months ago with some really great hands with Garrett battling Andy that I had the pleasure of commentating on. And check out Charlie Wilmoth's podcast, Third Man Walking, which is over on Crush Live Poker. Charlie was the commentator for this particular night, and we will definitely see more of him in future episodes of Hustler Casino Live.